The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee, perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And we are in for a real treat tonight and a blessing. Joseph P. Farrell is with us tonight. You can email Joseph at this address, V is in Victor, A-R-D is in David, A-S, and then the number 3 at AOL.com. And you can go to Joseph's website, GizaDeathStar.com. And Joseph P. Farrell is truly a brilliantly gifted researcher and a prolific author. He has a doctorate in patristics from the University of Oxford and has published 4 previous works that were all on theology. He recently moved back to his home state of South Dakota, where he pursues research on his other loves and hobbies, which include classical music. He is an organist. He plays the harpsichord and composes classical music. Truly fascinating, believe me. Physics, alternative history, and science, and just in general, strange stuff, out of the box thinking. Yeah. And Joseph's books, The Giza Death Star, The Giza Death Star Deployed, The Giza Death Star Destroyed, Reich of the Black Sun, and The SS Brotherhood of Bell, The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. Also, Joseph's new book, Secrets of the Unified Field. And we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to get into the Philadelphia experiment, the Nazi bell, and the discarded theory, along with a lot of other things. So, and I would like to mention up front that why don't the listeners to this audio please send some donations to Joseph and support his work. There are so few people out there of this caliber doing this kind of research and producing these, this level of brilliant material for all of us out here. I just really implore the listeners to send donations to Joseph P. Farrell. He is certainly deserving of it. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, GeorgeAnn. How are you?
I'm okay.
That's good.
Yes.
All moved to Oklahoma.
Yes.
Good. Excellent.
Yes. I've got poison ivy.
That's not good.
Surprise, surprise.
That's not good.
But I'm not allergic to it.
Oh, well, you're one of the lucky ones.
Yes.
I'm terribly allergic to that stuff.
Uh-oh. Well, Joseph, we are continuing our Cosmic War series.
Right.
Because basically all these things kind of come under that heading.
Right.
Ultimately. With your book here, the new one, let's go into who Morris Jessup was.
Okay.
And, give some background on that.
Well, Morris Jessup was an astronomer. He lived back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was a World War I veteran and then pursued his Ph.D. There's some debate, actually, whether he ever actually got his Ph.D., but he certainly did most of the work and fulfilled most of the requirements. I think it was at the University of Michigan that he was pursuing it, which is a very good school.
Yeah.
And he was a famous astronomer. He had been responsible for running the Southern Hemisphere's largest refracting telescope, which was at the time down in South Africa. And he made a number of very important astronomical discoveries, double star systems. I think it was actually Jessup who first cataloged some of those. So, you know, he was a mainstream scientist in every way. But during the course of his scientific research, he became fascinated with archaeology and with some of the sites in Central America and South America. And he concluded that the conventional, you know, the big Mexican pyramids and some of those big Inca structures, the big, huge stone block walls in Cusco and so on, just simply could not have been constructed by those civilizations using the conventional explanations that are given for their construction.
Right.
And he began to couple that with his other main interest, which was in UFOs. You know, long before J. Allen Hynek, another famous astronomer who became quite a serious proponent, actually, of UFOs, along with another physicist by the name of James McDonald, Jessup really was the first out of the box. And he, in the course of doing all of this research, he began to connect things together. And unlike the trend in ufology at that time, he began writing his first UFO books in the 1950s. And unlike most of the people at that time, he bucked the trend of ufology, which was at that time to push the origin of these spacecraft further and further out into the solar system, and for that matter outside of the solar system, as it became clear that the planets, you know, that are our neighbors, were not capable of supporting any life. So the trend in ufology was to push the origin of these craft further and further away from the Earth. Well, Jessup bucked that trend, oddly enough, in insisting that UFOs had to have, if they were spacecraft, they had to have an origin closer to Earth, much closer to Earth. So in many ways, this man was a very out-of-the-box thinker. And, you know, to his credit, because, you know, as I've argued in the Cosmic War and in the Giza Death Star books, the physics of UFOs isn't really sufficient to sustain the idea of an interstellar origin. You know, there are only one or two cases, in my opinion, that would indicate a physics sufficient, perhaps, for practical interstellar travel, you know, covering light years of distance.
Right.
So Jessup bucked this trend, and he published a book, I want to say circa 1953 to 55, but, you know, don't quote me on those dates. I'm not exactly certain. But he published a book called The Case for the UFOs. And what it is it's really a review of all of his thinking about all of these disparate topics, the strange archaeological anomalies that we find around the world, UFOs, and so on and so forth. And he came to the conclusion that there had to have been a very sophisticated civilization in very ancient times, predating the classical civilizations, of course, that we know, Sumer and Egypt and the Vedic civilization in India and China and so on. So he connected all of these dots in this book. And this book really is the origin of the Philadelphia experiment story, because it was this book, in turn, that was annotated by most likely Carlos Allende and perhaps one or two others. And it was sent to Admiral Firth at the Office of Naval Research in the Pentagon with all of these very strange markings, you know, and underlinings and different colored ink pens and very weird spelling, which I try and reproduce in the book.
I noticed that.
Yeah, it's just very, very strange, you know. It's like you're reading somebody that's not only dyslexic but smoking a few mushrooms of questionable character. But anyway, this book was sent along with all of these marginal annotations to this admiral in the Pentagon. And it came across the desk of a fellow by the name of Commander Hoover, commander in the Navy. And this man was a member of the Project Orbiter Committee, which at that time was America's committee that was trying to put up an artificial satellite. And this, of course, was before Sputnik. So, you know, this annotated book was making just extraordinary claims about anti-gravity and this and that and the other, but making them in connection to an experiment that the Navy, according to these annotators, had run during World War II, during which a ship was made invisible. It was, according to the annotators, performed at sea. And then, on top of all of that, they were claiming that this experiment was performed on the basis of Einstein's unified field theory. And additionally, which I found just, you know, people ask me why I write books in the order I do. Well, you know, it's all very deliberate, I have to assure people, because one of the strangest references that you find in this annotated edition of Jessup's book was that they refer to the Great Bombardment and this very ancient cosmic war.
Yeah.
You know, it just comes out, you know, it's a bolt out of the blue when you read it, you know, what's that doing here?
Yeah.
You know? So you can imagine these Navy officers reading all this. Well, they decided that there's at least enough there to investigate, and what they did was they contracted a publishing company in Garland, Texas, which is just outside of Dallas, and the publishing company's name was Varro, V-A-R-O, to print up copies of this book with the annotations for, you know, a very short-run set of books. You know, we're not talking any more than 150 or so copies, which they then circulated privately, according to all the evidence, to, quote, their top people, unquote. And, you know, this became known as the Varro edition. Well, the problem with the Varro edition is that somehow a fellow that was another famous UFO researcher at the period by the name of Gray Barker, he managed to get a hold of one of these things. He used to publish it with his old Saucerian press. Some of your listeners might remember, you know, if they've been following the UFO story for a number of years. He used to publish this book. But other than that, the book just sort of dropped off the face of the earth after Gray Barker's Saucerian press went out of business. You found occasionally snippets of it excerpted in the old Argosy magazine that used to be published back in the 70s. Brad Steiger and one or two other people, I think, published portions of this. But it just sort of dropped off the face of the earth. But lo and behold, thanks to the Internet, you know, the book is available again from, of all places, France.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, isn't that, you know, just put another monkey wrench in this very strange tale.
God bless the froggies.
Yes, God bless the French, you know, because they're not afraid to discuss this stuff openly over there, you know. So, you know, it's not a taboo subject. But of course, you know, the central component of this Varro annotated edition is still Jessup's book. Well, Jessup, as a result of this book being sent to the Pentagon, was contacted by the Pentagon and told, you know, well, we've got a copy of your book here. We'd really like to talk to you about it. So down he goes to Washington, D.C., and he's handed this copy. And in the meantime, I should let your listeners know that he had been contacted directly by Carlos Allende, who wrote him these very strange letters, and I reproduced those in the book, who told him in these very strange letters that, you know, the Navy had performed this invisibility experiment on the ship using Einstein's unified field theory, and it was successful, but it had a bunch of disastrous results, so the Navy shut it down, and so on and so forth. So, you know, here's Jessup sitting in the Pentagon reading his own book with these very strange annotations, and he's thinking, you know, my word, I've seen diction and spelling and speech like this before. And he proceeded to tell the Navy about these Allende letters. And in the meantime, of course, he'd also written Allende back. He was at first inclined to dismiss the whole thing as a hoax, but he got another letter from Allende spelling the whole thing out in more detail. So at that point, you know, Jessup's just thinking, well, there may be something to this, and he tried to write Allende back and get more information. But what happened was Jessup, being the out-of-the-box scientist that he was, began seriously to consider what might be necessary for these claims to be true. And he shared this information, his thoughts and so on, what he was doing with his research, and he never, I should make this very clear, he never published anything about the Philadelphia experiment. All that we know about what Jessup thought about it was what he relayed to his friends, Ivan Sanderson, who of course was another big researcher back then into paranormal phenomena, strange things and so on, and a friend of his who was an oceanographer down in Florida. So, what we know about what Jessup thought about the experiment comes largely from these two men who were friends of his who relayed what Jessup had told him. So, you have to kind of piece this story together very carefully. But in any case, both of his friends indicate, and I think do so independently. In other words, I don't think there's any collusion between them, because I don't even really know if they even knew each other. One lived up in New York and the other down in Florida. But they both maintain that Jessup was investigating this story from the standpoint of Einstein's unified field theory, which, as I outlined the case in the book, was probably his 1928 version of his unified field theory, because that version of his theory employs a peculiar mathematical expression called the torsion tensor. And, just to kind of refresh your listener's memory as to what the torsion tensor does, the effect of it, if you take a soda can, a pop can, and empty it of the soda, and then wring it like a dish rag, what that does in the can, of course, is it spirals it, and it folds and crinkles it, and makes the ends of the can draw closer together. Well, the torsion tensor does essentially the same thing to the fabric of space-time and any object in the vicinity where this is taking place. It folds and crinkles and spirals it. And Jessup, as he's considering this, it becomes very clear that this is a very plausible theoretical explanation for what Allende was saying happened in the Philadelphia experiment, invisibility of the ship and so on and so forth. So Jessup pursued this. He became interested as a result of this story in the Bermuda Triangle. Let's just throw the whole kitchen sink in here. So he became interested in the strange reports that were floating about the Bermuda Triangle. And again, he rationalized it on the basis of Einstein's 28th version of the unified field theory. And I should point out that when he does this, he's not being at all flaky. You may read about Jessup today and think, well, this guy's a nut. But he's really not, because, Einstein's general relativity, when it considered gravity and so on, it could only do so when it considered very large, very massive objects like planets and stars. And as a result of Einstein's theoretical assumptions in general relativity, it does not permit the idea of very localized differences in gravity and magnetism, okay? But his 1928 unified field theory does. So you have, with that theory, the theoretical foundation or an explanation as to why very strange places like that might exist on the Earth, like the Bermuda Triangle. So Jessup, is being very rational when he looks at it from this point of view. And he proceeds to try and explain why ships disappear in the Bermuda Triangle along the same way that he's trying to rationalize the Philadelphia experiment. Well, as a result of all this, he becomes further and further involved with the research that he's doing on the experiment. And then he begins to behave very oddly. He contacts his friend Ivan Sanderson, whom your listeners may even know. He's a very famous name in this paranormal field back then. And he has dinner with Sanderson and a few of their friends in New York City. He gives Sanderson a copy, actually 3 copies, of this Varro annotated edition of his book on UFOs. And he also gives to Sanderson a copy of his own annotations of his own book that he was making on the annotations that these other people made. Follow me?
Yes.
So then he also tells Sanderson that he, how does he put it? He is under a great deal of pressure, and please, if anything happens to me, don't believe that it was suicide, basically something to that effect.
Right.
He then moves to his other house in Florida where he meets his other friend, okay, who's the oceanographer, and schedules a dinner appointment, and again, his friend notices that Jessup seems to be very depressed, his behavior is very erratic, and he schedules a dinner appointment with his friend, but he never shows up. He's found by local police in his car with a hose running from the tailpipe up to the driver's side, barely alive.
Oh my.
Yeah. And he's rushed to the hospital, and he dies. Now, it's unclear whether he dies on the way to the hospital, at the hospital, but in point of fact, he dies, and of course, it looks like suicide.
Sure.
So, whether it was suicide or, my bet is probably that the man was offed.
Yes.
Because he was too much of a family man, and even though he had sort of stepped outside the pale of standard science by that time, he was by no means an irrational man. He was a fairly spiritual man, and his concern that he expressed to Sanderson and his other friend down in Florida was that he was concerned for his grandchildren. He was very, very concerned about that. So, this is not the sort of speech that you get from someone that's contemplating suicide.
Exactly.
So, it's very strange. And my belief is that Jessup was murdered by someone who suspected that he was getting too close to something, and it probably had to do with the Philadelphia experiment.
With that experiment,
Mm-hmm.
they said that men were trapped
Mm-hmm.
in the steel of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the bodies were.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that?
Well, this is an interesting question, and I'm glad you raised this point, because one of the things that, as I've been investigating the experiment for a number of years.
Yes.
But one of the things that you do not have in the original version of the story, as Allende told it to Jessup, or that you can even read about in the annotated edition of Jessup's book, this Varro edition, one of the things that is missing is precisely that component. You do not have that statement. So this is something, you have to be very careful with the Philadelphia experiment, because there's been a lot of myth and legend that have grown up around the original story. And that's one part of it. What Allende actually says is that sometimes the men who were exposed to the field that was set up in the ship, that they seemed to go into kind of a trance, and that they wouldn't even be able to move, and that they had to become, in his words, unstuck by laying on of hands. In other words, you'd have to go up and actually physically touch them to get them out of this state. And the other thing that he says is that in some cases, if these men were exposed to even a weak magnetic field, they would either spontaneously combust or just simply disappear right in front of your eyes.
Whoa.
Yeah, so in a way, what he says is actually a bit stranger than the subsequent story that we've been led to believe.
My.
But, he says a lot of strange stuff. But you can rationalize it if you speculate on the basis of what torsion does. Torsion also leaves kind of an imprint or a signature in an object. So if you recreate or are accidentally exposed to similar conditions at some subsequent point, you can actually induce the similar effect. So in a way, again, you can rationalize some of Allende's extremely wild claims by appealing once again to this 28 version of Einstein's unified field theory. And this goes back to something I said in a previous session, and that is that what Einstein really did was he made the idea of engineering space-time locally a practical idea. And so, my opinion is that the Philadelphia experiment probably did happen, because once you've understood that implication of his 1928 theory, then it would have been dereliction of duty for the United States Navy not to pursue some sort of practical application of that theory.
Well, of course they did. I
right,
mean,
of course they did.
Yeah, to think that they shut down something so dramatic.
Right.
And obviously very useful.
Right.
That's just poppycock that they would totally shut it down.
Right, exactly. It would be the same sort of situation as, the Nazis with their Bell project.
Right.
They've got this fantastic device, but they've run into trouble, so we're just going to give up,
Yeah,
Well,
really.
that just doesn't happen, especially during a war,
Yeah.
So, I think the experiment did happen. I do think that Allende, in spite of his kind of loony vocabulary and spelling and crazy ideas, I think substantially that what he said he saw, he saw. And, the real perplexion is, and I think I mentioned this in a previous session, that what they were aiming for with the Philadelphia experiment and what they actually got were two different things. Yes. I think they were completely and totally surprised at the magnitude of the effect that they achieved, although they did discuss the theoretical possibility, according to the research of Berlitz and Moore.
Now, Joseph, in the story, they say that the ship showed up in a harbor somewhere.
All right.
Is that valid? Or?
Okay, that's another part of the legend that grows up after Allende. It's not part of Allende's original story.
Okay.
It's research that Berlitz and Moore uncovered later. And the story is that the experiment was performed at a dock in Philadelphia, that as a result of this experiment, the ship entirely disappears and then reappears out of a green mist down at its other dock in Norfolk, Virginia, within a matter of minutes. Now, that's a distance of several hundred nautical miles.
Right.
So, and according to the story, it's observed by the captain of the British aircraft carrier Ark Royal, who makes a note of it in his operational log. The Yanks are up to something because we see this green mist, and then all of a sudden we see a ship where there wasn't a ship, and then we see the green mist again, and after the green mist goes, the ship is gone.
Wow.
So that's another part of the story. But even though it's a sensational part, if you look at what torsion does with that folding and pleating of space-time, again, you can rationalize it on the basis of that particular mathematical geometry. So again, you have to hold open the possibility, although I think it's a slim one. I tend to stick closer to Allende's original version, which incidentally, if you look at what Allende says, not what the legend says, if you look at what Allende actually says, he maintains very clearly, although it's just sort of ignored by most people, he maintains very clearly that this experiment was performed at sea, not in a dock.
Yeah.
And, to me, this was a real revelation when I actually sit down and just thought about the implications of that statement. Because, what he's actually saying is that probably, if we have a real project here, the Navy would have rationalized it exactly like any other secret research project. You're first going to perform proof-of-concept experiments at a small scale.
Yeah.
Which was probably done in the many testing tanks that the Navy had for its ship designs. There's a big testing facility there in Maryland where they take these big model ships and test them in these water tanks. They're actually over at the other end of South Dakota. There's actually a model, one of these big models the Navy made of the battleship South Dakota, precisely for this purpose. So you can kind of see that if an experiment is performed at sea, then this means the prior proof of concept experiments were successful, and this experiment that Allende is referring to is the tail end of a project where they're doing a test of the experiment at full power and under normal combat conditions. And that raises and opens up a whole other Pandora's box, but that's more or less what I think is going on here. And the interesting thing, when as I get into in the book, is that when you piece all the little different disparate parts of the evidence together, you end up with the experiment having been performed very close to Bermuda.
Oh boy, yeah. Yikes.
Yeah, yikes.
Yeah. Well, when they bend this time and space thing that they do, that is, if someone is in that vicinity,
right,
they would experience what we would call paranormal, wouldn't they?
Well, sure. Depending on the degree of torsion effect that you would have, you could experience time dilations. You could experience, in other words, missing time.
Yes.
You could experience very peculiar perceptions of space itself.
Mm-hmm.
If you're literally folding and bending space, that stands to reason. But the other thing to bear in mind is you're folding and bending the time and space that occurs inside of your own brain.
Yeah.
So, you're altering perception as well. So there's an objective component to this part, and there's a subjective one. So, there's any number of things that could happen, and we really don't know what might happen under extreme circumstances. But I don't think the Navy was looking for this to happen. I think what happened is, by dint of the experiment, when they did it at full power, they crossed some threshold that, was not there in the science or in their theoretical predictions according to their best ability. The Navy, the research of Berlitz and Moore indicates that the Navy did, in fact, consider that one possible effect of a full-scale experiment would be optical invisibility. But beyond this, I have not been able to find any evidence that the Navy considered the possibility of extreme time dilations or teleportation or anything of this sort. But again, that might fall out if you cross some threshold that you don't know about.
Yeah, and there's a lot we don't know.
And there's a lot we don't know, exactly.
Now, I read somewhere, Joseph, that when they did this, it created some kind of a time warp or bubble or something from wherever they did this experiment clear to what we would call Area 51 out in that vicinity.
Well, there is a movie about the Philadelphia experiment. It stars Michael Paré and I forget who else in it. But there is a movie out where this is the central premise of the movie, that they created a time dilation effect that had persisting and lasting effects, and they were trying to undo it at some Area 51-like facility out in the American Southwest. So this is another aspect of the legend, but it's not part of the original story. And the reason I suspect that it probably did not happen is that, if you're taking torsion and applying it to space-time, let's take our soda can and now make it a foam rubber soda can, okay? Once you release the stresses that you're putting on that foam rubber cylinder as you twist it, as you wring it like a dish rag, then what happens? It springs back, it snaps back into its original shape, okay?
Right.
Space-time is a medium that's very much like that. If you remove the stressors, it's going to snap back into its original shape, okay? So I think really that we have have to probably discount that idea. I'm not discounting the idea of a time distortion or the possibility of a teleportation, but I am discounting the possibility that we have all of these, black holes and stuff being created, or time-traveling individuals and so on and so forth that you hear have grown up around the legend. I stick very close to the original version of the story.
Well, when you hear people, and there's a lot of them, Joseph, that experience this phenomena of missing time.
Right.
Could they have driven into or walked into, or maybe, while they're sitting in their house, someone's experimenting, there are just some really weird things that are going on.
Well, yes, barring clinical problems that would induce those things.
Right.
You have to, once you entertain the idea that the physics exists, and I think it does, and it clearly has since at least the Second World War, if not before. If you entertain the idea that the physics exists, then you have to entertain the idea that at least some of these phenomena can be rationalized on the basis of that physics. So the answer is certainly, that's a definite possibility.
Ooh, that's scary.
It's very scary.
Gee. Gosh. Well, what about, there's something also that Jessup talked about, air and rigidity.
Okay, yes. One of the things that Jessup was trying to explain when he began investigating the Bermuda Triangle in connection with his Philadelphia experiment investigations was why so many aircraft and ships seem to just utterly fall off the face of the earth in that region of the world.
Yeah.
And he comes up with a very interesting explanation that, if you were to create, and his analogy here that he uses to explain it to his friend, his oceanographer friend, is a very good analogy. He uses the analogy of iron filings in the magnetic field. Well, if you have a clump of iron filings piled on a piece of paper, they're just a clump of iron filings. They don't have any particular shape. They don't have any particular form, and, you can poke your finger into them and move them around.
Right.
Okay? But if you expose those iron filings to a very strong magnetic field, what happens? They assume the shape of that field. Okay? And if the field is strong enough, you can poke your finger into those filings all you want, and they're just going to stay put.
Yeah.
So he says a similar thing might occur by means, again, of electromagnetic interferometry. You might be able to create a standing wave, a longitudinal wave, which, as you'll recall, is like a sound wave. It's an area of pressure and rarefaction. So you might be able to create an area where the air assumes, because of this interference pattern that you set up within it, you literally create a column of air that is absolutely rigid. It's invisible, but it's rigid. It's like a solid mass.
Okay, if you touched it, you'd feel it?
Yeah, sure. And if you fly a plane into it,
boom.
Boom.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same thing, of course, he's using air here, in my opinion, as a kind of an allegory for the fabric of space-time itself, because, again, you can take this torsion tensor and do essentially the same thing. And if that sounds fanciful, let's remember what Einstein's general relativity does. It says that a large mass warps space-time, okay? But if you really look at the mathematics of the theory will also allow you to say that a warp of space-time creates a large mass. You follow me? So in other words, the two are equivalent. They're two sides of an equal sign in an equation. Large mass creates a warp of space-time. A warp of space-time creates a large mass. Okay?
Yeah.
So Jessup is saying essentially the same thing. If you do this with a degree of extremity, you can create, I use the word virtual mass in one of my Giza Death Star books. You can create a kind of a virtual mass, which if you have an object plowing into it, rather dramatic effect on that object. So, yeah, this is how Jessup rationalizes some of these things.
Well, Joseph, this is very interesting because, and I'm not sure, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I think it was Berlitz in one of his books wrote about an incident up around the Great Lakes of a jet plane that was flying, and all of a sudden, he says in this book, it was as if this plane hit a wall and came straight down.
Yes, I think I know the book. I don't remember if it may have been one of his Atlantis books or something, but I think it was Berlitz. And there's been another author out there, I think, that's pointed out this same incident.
Yeah, very strange.
It's very strange. But, again, it's strange in the sense that if you don't know that there's a physics that would make it possible, it's strange. But there is a physics that would make it possible. I've been exploring this physics in all of my books. It's basically the theme of my books.
Well, my gosh, Joseph, I mean, how would a pilot know?
You wouldn't.
See, what a shield.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and the obvious, and let me postpone my thought here to go off on a tangent, because you mentioned this idea of a shield and how it falls out of the physics of the Philadelphia experiment. Well, interestingly enough, as I mentioned in the book, one of the things that was a primary motivation for the experiment to begin with, as far as I've been able to see, was precisely the idea of setting up a similar type of interference pattern in the immediate environs of a ship that would deflect projectiles. And, of course, what the Navy's thinking is in terms of altering, the pressure differential of the atmosphere around it. Because, a projectile is a ballistic object, and it will change course ever so slightly if you alter pressure and so on and so forth. That's why they had these big computers on those ships back then, because those long-range naval guns, you have to fire them very accurately. So, this was one of the rationalizations. It's kind of like the U.S. Navy's 1940s version of Star Wars. Okay, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Well, if you take this idea and make it extreme, you're exactly right. What a shield, So there's no doubt in my mind that the physics was pursued by somebody somewhere off the books, and once we get into the full implications of that physics, you betcha the United States Navy is going to be pursuing it, and you know that the Nazis are. So,
yes, and the Russians.
And the Russians, exactly. So, it's not a difficult thing once you understand the principles of the physics to see that the major powers are certainly going to be investigating this stuff.
How would it affect people that live close to one of these so-called, I call them the shields?
Right. Well, this physics, the interesting thing, you mentioned the Russians. I have a book at a publisher right now. It's a different publisher than has published my previous books. The publisher is going to be Farrell House, F-E-R-A-L. The book is called The Philosopher's Stone.
Oh, yes.
And the subtitle is called The American Gold, the Soviet Mercury, and the Nazi Serum. Because, and one of the things I explore at great length in this book, it should be out next spring around February, somewhere between February and April. So, place your orders now.
Yeah.
But one of the things I explore at great length is the work that went in Soviet Russia dealing with this type of physics. And one aspect of the project was precisely to use this physics to impress a template. Again, remember, a torsion field sets up an internal dynamic within any object it comes into.
Yeah.
So once that dynamic is set up, it tends to last a while, even after the original influence is removed. And that is particularly the case in biological systems. I
remember we talked about templates. Give a little overview of that so to refresh people, because that is fascinating.
Well, the template is just another word for this area where you're interfering electromagnetic energy. You know, you've got two or more beams impinging on an area, and what that does is just like throwing several rocks into a pond. You're going to create a pattern of ripples on the surface of the pond that is the template, that pattern of ripples. And, you know, if you do it properly, you set up a standing wave, that pattern just stands there, okay?
Yeah.
Although the waves are actually moving, the total effect is zero, okay?
Yeah.
Because that pattern just sits there. Well, that's what I mean by a template. And you impose this template on a biological system. You can do so and set up a resonance effect within the cells of the system. And that effect, in turn, will do one of two things. It will either induce disease. You know, a disease has a specific resonance.
Yes, frequency.
Okay? A frequency, right.
Yes.
So you alter the cell structure, and you can either initiate diseases or you can initiate cures. Right? You know, everyone of your listeners is probably familiar with the name of Dr. Royal Raymond Rife.
Oh, yes.
You know, and this was essentially his approach. Well, the Soviets were dabbling in a major way with the very same phenomena. And, of course, you recall the stories back in the 70s during, what's his name? President Nixon. I forgot President Nixon for a while. But anyway, you remember the stories back in the 70s during the Nixon administration of people at our embassy in Moscow just contracting cancer from nowhere.
Right.
Well, it turned out that the Soviets were bombarding the embassy with microwaves. You know, and, you know, bombard people with microwaves long enough, and, you know, they're going to get cancer. But if you do it, you know, fine-tune the procedure and set up the resonance in people that will produce particular types of cancer, you see.
Yes.
That's what they were doing. So, this was one of the byproducts of all of this research that the Soviet Union was doing from the 50s to the 70s. So, you know, and I, you know, in The Philosopher's Stone, this book that is at Farrell House, I talk about the Russian scientist, and again, guess what? He's an astronomer.
Oh.
You know, so, you know, why are astronomers involved in this?
Well, they're studying God's book in the sky.
Well, but more importantly, you know, let's boil it down to the hard scientific specifics. What they're doing is they're noticing, as this Russian astronomer did, they're noticing that the standard model, the standard scientific theory of thermonuclear fusion in stars cannot account for all the energy that they put out. In other words, if the thermonuclear fusion, you know, the idea that a star is nothing but a big hydrogen bomb in a state of perpetual detonation, if that theory were true, then our sun would be putting out far less energy than it is. So, you know, this Russian astronomer, his name is Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev, he immediately concluded, well, that model is wrong, and therefore there has to be another source of energy here that we simply don't know about. And, of course, you know, I've mentioned way back when we first had our sessions going that one of the problems that we first ran into when we fired off the first hydrogen bomb was we calculated a yield of about 4 to 6 megatons, and we lit the thing off, and it ran away to about 10 megatons. You know, now, you know, a 4 million ton miscalculation is a pretty sizable bang.
Yeah.
You know, 4 million tons of TNT will do a lot of damage.
No, truly.
So, you know, there was another source of energy. And I suspect that the Russians, the reason that this work was classified so highly in the Soviet Union was that this man had noticed the same thing about stars, and the Russians had noticed the same thing when they were firing off their hydrogen bombs, you know, like, whoa, you know, where did all that come from? You know? So, you know, they had this astronomer out there who was investigating stars and coming across the same thing, and a very peculiar thing, and I mentioned this in I'm writing another book. So I've got one at the press, and I'm finishing up one now.
Yeah.
But I mentioned this in both books. Pravda attacked this man just unmercifully in the late 1950s, denounced him as a fraud and all of this and that and the other. Well, I suspect that, Kozyrev was not a fly-by-night flake by any means. I mean, he's a well-known, established astronomer. There's even a theory named after him in astronomy. So, this guy's hardly a flake. So when Pravda denounces him, I suspect what they're really doing is that they're attempting to delegitimize his work.
Sure.
And, at this point, you never hear of Kozyrev after this. His work disappears into these highly classified projects in the Soviet Union, and only when the Soviet Union collapses do we find out that, hey, this man was pursuing this research for those 30 years, and coming up with some very astonishing results. So,
is he still alive, Joe?
No, Dr. Kozyrev, I think, died in I want to say the 80s or early 90s, somewhere around there. He was a very elderly man, a very genteel man, because he had suffered 16 years imprisonment at the hands of Stalin in the Gulag. He was a very genteel man, but certainly, a towering intellect by anyone's way of reckoning.
Yeah.
And so this is what I think went on in the Soviet Union, and we find this pattern over and over again. I like I say, I have another book I'm writing right now where I found a very similar project involving very similar things that was just totally and roundly denounced by the press, while quietly and off the books, guess what?
Oh, sure. That old saying, I think they protest too much.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, it's entirely possible what you're saying, that, this template can induce disease or healing.
Sure.
And, just stop and consider the implications of that, GeorgeAnn, because what we've really said is that there is a whole other way, there is a whole other approach to medicine and healing.
Oh, yes.
Other than popping pills.
Absolutely.
Or radical surgery.
Yeah.
Or sitting in a microwave oven and, cooking tumors.
Yeah.
There's a whole other way of dealing with these things that is totally off the books and denied, in this country, just downright, if you go to the FDC and propose some of these methods, they will literally either laugh at you or throw you in prison, as they did to Royal Rife. So the mind boggles at all the implications of this physics. It's just phenomenal. But again, it's because it's a physics that falls out from this idea of a unified field theory. And once you say that you have a unified physics, then you're going to have a whole host of applications from very benign and good ones to some really horrendous ones.
Yeah, definitely. Just as a little side note.
Sure.
I've moved to Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm out here in a very rural area, Joseph.
I know the area. I used to live in Oklahoma. I know exactly the area you're talking about.
Well, it's beautiful out here.
Yes, it's people don't realize that there are just genuine mountains in Oklahoma.
Well, when I got here, if I wanted to use my cell phone, I had to run out in the road practically, way out there in my front porch.
Right.
The other day, I was walking down the driveway between my neighbor and I, and I looked, and I'll be damned, there's a huge cell tower.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked my neighbor, I said, do you see that? He says, that wasn't there before.
Right. Yeah.
These damn things follow me. I mean, just overnight, there it is.
Yeah.
Out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. They're getting ready to keep track of everybody, or at least attempt to.
Oh, sure. But, okay, now we have this swastika cancer. Yes.
Well, you're mentioning the chapter title of one of the chapters in Secrets of the Unified Field.
Fascinating book.
It really is, and that that really is to me one of the most fascinating chapters in it, because the swastika, which of course is sort of the corporate logo of the Nazi Party,
Yeah.
it's really, if you stop and think about it, the Nazis were propagandists of a supremely competent degree. Because that symbol has become, even prior to the end of the war, when we associated it with all the gruesome crimes and barbarism of the regime, before all that aspect of Nazism was known, it was nevertheless so carefully orchestrated a campaign to make that the visible symbol of not only the party ideology, but of the Third Reich. The swastika is probably, along with the cross and the Muslim crescent and so on, or the Soviet hammer and sickle, it's probably one of the best-known symbols, if not the best-known symbol. So, people tend to think of it as precisely a ideological symbol, as a political symbol now.
Right.
But, as I mentioned in that book, in that chapter, for the Nazis, it's a symbol of this physics, because the swastika exactly describes, even to the point you can do a mathematical analysis, which I do a very, very basic one in that chapter. And trust me, there's no equations. Don't be afraid, people. It's just, I introduce people to some very basic concepts of tensor calculus in order to explain what's going on. And as you know from having read it, it's very simple stuff once you see it. But the swastika is an exact ideogram. This is the fascinating thing. It's an exact ideogram of precisely this type of rotational physics. It's an ideogram of this folding, spiraling, and twisting of space that torsion accomplishes. So, and I even get into this in much more detail in the book, The Philosopher's Stone, that's at Farrell House right now. I get into it in a lot more detail. I sort of introduce the concept and secrets of the unified field, and then really delve into its use in that fashion by some of the closest advisors to Heinrich Himmler. And when I say use in that fashion, I mean use as an ideogram of a physics. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, the Nazis were very careful not only to pick a symbol and propagandize it, but they knew the physics implications of it. So let's just sit down. If we're Professor Dr. Walter Gerlach, who of course becomes the project head of the Bell. If we're Professor Dr. Gerlach, we've got our Nobel Prize in hand. We're a world-renowned physicist. Our specialty is gravitation and magnetic field separation and spin resonance and all of this stuff, okay? And yet, even though we're an ardent supporter of the Nazi regime, which he was, we are nevertheless a genuine enough scientist that we're not going to be denouncing Einstein, which is a really interesting thing about Gerlach. He never did. Yeah. So you can imagine, if you're going to sell a project like the Bell to the Nazis, and you're going to be using torsion, which of course was, Einstein helped invent one version of the torsion tensor. So it's kind of hard to avoid his name and connection with it.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. It's difficult. The only other version was a version by an Italian mathematician by the name of Ricci. So there's actually two different torsion tensors, but the effect is the same. In Ricci's version, it's a little bit more pronounced. In fact, it's a lot more pronounced. But anyway, so you're Gerlach, and you're going to go to the Nazi regime and say, well, I've got this really cool idea for a project on how we can manipulate the fabric of space-time, accomplish anti-gravity, and have a really kick-ass super weapon.
Oh, boy.
So, but the problem is I've got to use torsion to do it. And, well, we can't have that, Professor Dr. Gerlach, because, of course, torsion is connected to that terrible, terrible Jewish physicist Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
Well, how would Gerlach sell this idea? How would he promote it, in that kind of climate? Very easily, by saying, look, your own party symbol, the symbol of the Third Reich, is a symbol of this physics. And as I point out, again, as I mentioned, in The Philosopher's Stone, I point out that one of Heinrich Himmler's top occult advisors uses this symbol as a means of explaining a very ancient physics. Mm-hmm. Is this beginning to sound like there's a connection to Giza Death Star?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you betcha. Of course. All of this stuff is interconnected. So, Gerlach has only to point to the swastika itself and say, there is the proof that this is not Jewish physics. It's not this or that physics at all. It's just there.
It's ancient.
It's very ancient. It's as ancient as the swastika itself. Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of ancient, Joseph, in the book of Genesis, in the beginning, where it says, the earth was without form and it was void, and, there was no man to till the soil. There was, there was nothing there. I kind of have the impression, very strong impression, that was the pre-Adamic flood. There had to have been, I think, a huge war to cause the planet to be in that condition.
Well, as I point out in the Cosmic War, there has been for a number of centuries what's called the gap theory of creation. And it occurs because there are verses in the book of Jeremiah, I believe, that indicate a time when there were cities and they were desolate, the birds weren't flying, and so on and so forth, and the earth was, and again, reference is made to the earth being without form and void, and then you go on in that context to talk about these empty cities and so on and so forth.
Right.
So there has been, because of this, for a number of centuries, the idea that there was actually a creation before the creation. And,
what makes us think that had to have been the first creation?
Well, exactly. Well, there are a number of reasons why that emerges, theologically, that idea.
Yeah.
But it basically, as I point out in the Cosmic War, you do have the possibility of there being two very cataclysmic events in the solar system, and that both of them would have triggered massive flooding or other types of catastrophes. So, I don't have any difficulty with that. So, again, you have to hold open the possibilities based on not just a consideration of ancient texts, but based on the fact that the physics itself, the celestial mechanics involved, and the physical evidence that we see in the solar system tends to support that view.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. I'm glad I'm not a nut.
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
Thank you.
No, you have good company with that view. St. Jerome and a few others way back when.
Well, good. Now I want to bring up something else. Years ago, I read a book by Bruce Cathy, and he mentioned seeing these weird spaceships, and they were like planting something deep in the earth. Something would come out of the bottom of the ship and go down into the earth. If this is true, Joseph, would that have been, or could that have been them reviving the grid system on the planet?
Oh boy. Well, I'm not familiar with that particular story that Cathy has come out with. I haven't read all of his books. Incidentally, Cathy also maintains this idea that nuclear weapons were gating energy.
Right.
I don't think his explanation for that is quite correct, but he is onto the fact that it's got something to do with celestial geometries at the time of the detonation.
Yeah.
So, yes, he's got that part. But as to this story, I'm not familiar with it. But as to the world grid, I think it may be possible for the following reason. that if we look at these ancient megalithic structures, Teotihuacan, Machu Picchu, Stonehenge, Silbury Hill, Giza, the big pyramids in China, and so on and so forth, all of these sites are set out weirdly on this grid system.
Yeah.
Now, my explanation for the grid may be a bit different than most people. I don't believe that it has anything to do with what you hear in the standard fare New Age literature as all part of some glorious sacred geometry, yada, yada, yada.
I agree with you.
It has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's the physics that I look to. If you take a sphere, let's go to Buckminster Fuller, for example.
Oh, yes.
What he did was he took balloons, he covered them with paint, submerged them in water, and then bombarded them with sound waves. Mm-hmm. And what this did is it would produce an interference pattern on the surface of these balloons. It would produce a grid, okay? Yeah. And, you know, you'd have certain little nodal points where there wouldn't be any interference, and then you'd have these intricate and delicate spidery patterns on the surface and so on. I think this is the explanation for the grid. I think, you know, like any other spherical object that has a resonance, the Earth sets up a standing wave, and this creates this grid effect on the surface of the Earth. Because, you know, these sites are precisely set over the nodes where that interference is not present, where the ripples do not interfere with each other. There are certain places, you know, that if you throw rocks into a pond, you're going to see quiet. You're going to see nothing. Wow. And then you're going to see areas where you have these intricate, delicate, spidery, interlaced patterns of waves, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, most of these sites are set around the nodes, not the waves, which I find very interesting because, again, the whole essence of this type of physics is you create a total pattern of waves or vectors of force that sum to zero. So these nodes become very important to be able to set up these standing waves, and that's where all of these temples and so on are located. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that whoever built Teotihuacan knew what they were doing in terms of the physics. I'm not saying that whoever built Stonehenge knew what they were doing in terms of this physics. By that time in history, in fact, I think that they probably didn't and were acting on the basis, well, this is just the sacred geometry of the gods, and, you know, this is where we're going to build it.
I agree with you there.
Okay?
Yeah.
But there is one site on Earth where I do think the physics in the structure is sufficient to indicate that whoever built it knew all about this stuff, and that precisely is the Great Pyramid at Giza.
At Giza, yes.
There, I think we are dealing with a monument or a relic, not only of a society, which of course would make it not Egypt, that knew all about this physics and built it into the structure and chose that site deliberately for that reason. But in that one case only do I think we find that on the surface of the Earth. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm dealing here with two different levels of phenomena. One phenomenon is that you can rationalize it on the basis of the physics. But in the case of all of the other monuments, even though the physics underlying it may have been forgotten, that's the reason that ultimately they were put there, even though the people doing it didn't know it.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I do. I totally agree with that. You know, like and I've mentioned this before, Joseph, mm-hmm. like Chichen Itza.
Right.
That was not, whoever built that had legs as long as you and I are tall.
Oh, probably.
You know, I've walked up and down that thing, and you've got to...
You've got to stretch.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's again a little further testament that, you know, we're dealing with giants in the literal sense, you know. And I mentioned the evidence for the existence of very large humanoid creatures of large stature in the cosmic war, and there is more than people might think. And again, you know, a lot of it is recorded from the first instance of European contact with the Indians in the Americas, because in many cases they'll record that some of these Indians were extraordinarily tall.
Yeah.
So, you know, so it's something that is there in the record. We just don't want to face up to it. This is why I think our education system is just all wet right now, because you just simply cannot discuss this stuff in the so-called modern academy. They just don't permit it. They don't want to look at it because it implies too many things.
Oh, sure. I mean, well, we're looking at an educational system that wants to sexualize 4-year-olds by teaching them sex. I mean, how intelligent is that?
Not very.
Right. Stupid. Totally stupid.
Totally.
Okay, another question.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when, you know, you've heard, I imagine, when people go into a place that they say is haunted, there'll be a cold spot.
Right.
Okay? This would have something to do, would it not, of whatever that entity is that's making that spot cold has removed the energy?
Oh, yes, yeah, precisely. Yeah. One of the things about this physics, you know, it's very interesting. When I first started investigating all of this stuff about 30 years ago, and particularly in connection with Nazi Germany, one of the claims that you found in the literature back then, although there wasn't much substantiation for it, and it was always highly questionable because these claims were coming out of neo-Nazi circles in Europe and America, was that the Nazis were working on some sort of quote-unquote cold bomb that would turn everything to ice. Okay.
Well, isn't that what happened up in the where they found all these mastodons with buttercups in their stomach?
Perhaps.
Similar.
We'll get to that in a minute. But as time wore on and more information started coming out of what was really going on in the Third Reich with all of this very, very strange physics. And again, you know, the signal event that kicked loose most of this material was the reunification of Germany. Because, you know, what that did was it made accessible for the first time since the end of the war all of those test sites that used to lie in the Eastern Zone. And the second thing it did is it kicked loose from all of those archives in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union even. It kicked loose from those archives all those documents that had been hidden for decades. And as a result, you know, the United States and Great Britain were more or less forced to declassify a lot of their stuff.
Yeah.
So, you know, German reunification has, you know, for investigators of alternative science and history, it has really been the signal event that is still reshaping the way we think and how we're going to explain some of the very weird things that occurred at the end of the war, you know, from just ordinary military operations all the way up to the sightings of Foo Fighters and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It was a signal event, and one of the things that it did was it made another look at this claim to having a cold bomb possible. Because one of the results of this physics, let's go back to my idea of a template. Okay? This template can not only infer or impinge a pattern or a resonance on an object to affect healing or disease or what have you, or, you know, create solid columns of air or whatever.
Right.
But another effect that it can do is it can affect a relationship between the transmitter of the signal and the object. So, in other words, the transmitter can actually become kind of a receiver and can actually suck energy out of it, okay, and do so almost instantaneously. So, in other words, you might, with this physics, be able, if you had developed it sufficiently and were proficient at it and had the equipment to do it, theoretically, you could take a region and simply freeze it. Just bang, just in an instant.
Yeah.
Suck the energy right out of it. You could, by the same token, load energy into it, cook it, you know.
Okay, now, if a person were in that area and they were sufficiently protected, what would they see? What would they feel? What would they sense?
Well, if they were sufficiently protected, they would experience if they weren't totally isolated from the environment, they would experience, if you were freezing something, they would experience a cooling.
Sure.
They would experience perhaps a certain slowdown of their mental faculties and so on and so forth. So, it's depending on what type of shielding you're talking about. But, you'd experience some things like that. So, we might, again, rationalize some paranormal phenomena on the basis of this physics and the ability to manipulate it.
Well, it's been stated numerous places, Joseph, that in various buildings, etc., there'll be like a room in there that's just icy cold.
Right.
And people will sense a presence in there. Okay. Popularly, we would call it a demonic presence. Is there a difference between a demonic presence of an entity that may suck the energy out of an area in order to manifest themselves in some form? Would it be the same principle as technology doing something like that?
I have no difficulty believing that some spiritual phenomena are the result of a technology. In other words, I don't oppose the idea that the demonic has to use a technology to accomplish what it's doing.
Yes.
Okay? I have no difficulty with that whatsoever. And the reason is not so much scientific but philosophical. Yeah. It's only really in the last 200 to 250 years that the Western mind has opposed the spiritual and the physical, and thereby the spiritual and the technological. But this, the whole Christian sacramental tradition is in opposition to that point of view.
Right. And
the whole ancient worldview would have been very, very different. The technological was religious and spiritual, and vice versa.
Yes.
They didn't have this neat Copernican Cartesian separation in their heads that we do today. So I have no difficulty with that. And in fact, I think probably something like that is the case. There is a famous early Christian saint around the 8th century by the name of John of Damascus, who wrote a treatise called On the Orthodox Faith. And in it he talks about angels. And if you sit down and read it, at one point he makes a very suggestive allusion. And if you translate it into modern physics terms, it's almost as if he's saying that in order to manifest themselves, angels have to slow down.
Okay, yeah.
In other words, they're moving in, it's almost, if we can put it in Einsteinian terms, it's almost as if the speed of light is not an upper limit to acceleration. It's a boundary condition between two different types of existence.
Yes, very good, yes.
So, someone living above that boundary condition is, in order to manifest themselves to us, going to have to slow down.
Right.
Right. And that requires losing energy. So, I realize I'm just horribly mangling poor Einstein here. He doesn't have a chance to defend himself. But just kind of speculating a bit. And if they were alive today, Aquinas or John of Damascus, if they were alive today and were reading some of this physics, what they would be saying is that okay, well, all of your hyperdimensional physics stuff, that's what we're talking about when we talk about angelic existence, okay, and the type of existence that they have.
Yeah.
So, again, I don't have any difficulty whatsoever in thinking of those in those terms.
Boy. Oh, it just gets more and more fascinating, I'll tell you.
Oh, it does. It does. It does.
Joseph, could we move to a part 2 and get into Mars and Phobos?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, everybody. Joseph Farrell and I are going to move on to a part 2. That will be Cosmic War 10B, as in boy. Yeah. And I would make another pitch to all of you listening. Please support Joseph Farrell and his work. I'm asking all of you that are listening to send some donations to Joseph. And Joseph, how can they do that?
I do have a website. It's called www.Giza Death Star. That's GizaDeathStar.com. That's all lowercase. And there's a little donation button up there. They can use PayPal to do that. And the books, again, all of my books right now are with Adventures Unlimited Press. And that's 1-800-718-4514. All of the books, with the exception of Cosmic War and Secrets of the Unified Field, are $16.95 each. Those two books are $18.95 each, but there is a discount of 10% on 3 or more books. And if you call that 800 number, please do so during normal business hours. I've been told I've been waking up Jerry. So.
Oh, I love him. He's such a good guy.
Yeah, he is. He is. He's a good researcher, too.
Yes. Yes.
But, and again, they can get the books at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I do have a book coming out with Farrell House in the early spring next year that's called The Philosopher's Stone. And the subtitle of that is The American Gold, the Soviet Mercury, and the Nazi Serum. And I have a book I'm writing on right now, trying furiously to finish up, because I've got a September deadline with that publisher, and that, again, will be Adventures Unlimited doing that. And that book is tentatively, for right now, it is titled The Nazi International, and then the subtitle to that is The Nazis' Post-War Plan to Control Science, Finance, Space, and Conflict.
Yeah, well, they're not doing very good with finance right now.
Oh, actually, I think they're doing, from their standpoint, I think they're doing just wonderfully. You know, these corporate greedsters, it's you know, just a comment here. I very seldom comment politically. But, you know, one of the most deleterious things that has happened in the West over the centuries is in law, making a corporation a person.
You're right. Yeah.
And, you know, from my standpoint, a pox on both your houses, Democrats and Republic crooks alike.
Yes.
Because we are not going to curb the power of these evil monsters that are doing the things to the American people and everybody else that they can figure out to do them to, until we remove the idea that a corporation has a legal status as a person.
Right.
Person is a, you know, and again, that's a fascinating story, because, of course, person is a theological concept.
Yeah.
And this idea of corporate personhood arises during the Middle Ages in the Christian West. So, you know, there's a theological aspect to this that most people are unaware of. But, you know, we've really got to get back to rethinking a lot of our very foundational principles in our society and civilization, because it's just ruining us. These people are just hiding behind that legal ability and manipulating it for their own, to my mind, very wicked purposes.
Yes,
so, you know, that's my political thought for the day.
Joseph, I agree with you 100%. You are absolutely right on. Yeah, you bet. Okay, everybody, get busy. Help Joseph. Support his work. Get the books. and make some donations to Joseph P. Farrell. And we are moving on right now to part 10B, as in boy. All right. God bless all of you listening.
The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee. Perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.